Okay, and then what happens is De Vaca goes back. He goes to Mexico City, and he tells the viceroy, that was the colonial official that kind of ran things in Mexico, because it took forever to get from North America back to Spain. The viceroy, he was the colonial governor. You might want to think about it of this period, this area, and this period of Texas history. And he says that some of the Indians, natives, that Americans that he was, or indigenous folks that he was with, they talked about that there were cities north of where De Vaca traveled. Remember, De Vaca traveled mostly in northern Mexico. So we're talking about Arizona, New Mexico, that area. That there was great mineral wealth. And remember, the Spanish, they had taken, the Spanish became the wealthiest country on earth because of the mineral wealth they had discovered in what's now Mexico and what's now Peru. Uh, Gold, silver, jewels that they stole from the Aztecs and the Indians, but there were also silver mines in the middle of Mexico. So the Spanish, they think it's quite possible that there might be some more mineral wealth in this unexplored territory, which is pretty much now Arizona and New Mexico. And so the viceroy, De Vaca says, this is what I heard. I didn't really see it myself, but this is what I heard. And so what the viceroy does, he sends up a friar named Deniza to kind of check out the southern Arizona, southern New Mexico territory. And one of the folks that goes with this guy, Niza, is Esteban Stephen, the Moorish slave who had traveled with De Vaca. And Deniza comes back to Mexico City and he goes, De Vaca's right. There's fantastic mineral wealth in this area. And to this day, we don't know if Deniza was lying, if he was exaggerating. He might have seen, some of the quartz, that kind of stone. It sparkles in the sun. If you've ever been to that area of the country, and maybe Deniza just his imagination ran away with him. But anyway, what happens is Deniza comes back with this report, and the viceroy decides, okay, this is fantastic. And so what he does is he mounts a expedition of about 1,000 folks, and he puts in charge of this expedition a guy by the name of Coronado. And Coronado, it's kind of a public-private partnership. Coronado pays for some of this expedition. It's very, very expensive. The Spanish government pays for some of it as well. And in February of 1540, about 10 years or so after De Vaca washes up in Texas, but this is a direct result of De Vaca coming to Mexico City and saying he'd heard that there was mineral wealth, and Deniza backing him up. Now, just to have a digression for a second, the Spanish were primed to hear this. There was this myth or this legend. It was called the Seven Cities of Cibola, Cibola. And in Spain and in the New World, there had been the story that the seven Catholic bishops had left Spain when it was conquered by the Muslims in the year 711, and they'd sailed west. Okay? And so there were all these wild stories that these Catholic bishops had ended up in North America and had created these cities, and that there was great wealth in these cities. And it seems to us ridiculous now. How can anybody be so stupid as to believe this? But the Spanish I mean, it was incredible what they found in Mexico City, what's now Mexico City, the Aztec capital, in Peru with Incas. And so the Spanish were kind of primed to believe, well, crazier things have happened. So when Niza comes back and it kind of works into this story about the seven cities of Cibola that supposedly these Catholic bishops had, when they fled Spain, had come to the New World and created. So anyway, so Coronado gets up an expedition with the help of the Viceroy of Mexico City, the governor of this province. And in 1540, 1,000 men march from Mexico City up the western coast of Mexico into what today is New Mexico and Arizona. And Father Niza is on this expedition. By the way, Esteban is on the expedition as well, but he acts really terribly. We don't really know what he did, but he is murdered by Indian groups once he goes into what's now New Mexico. And so this big expedition goes into New Mexico, goes into Arizona, and it's completely different from the expedition from de Vaca's story. Coronado is very frustrated because he doesn't find any mineral wealth. He's expecting to find a lot of mineral wealth, and there's just not a lot of mineral wealth in that part of what's now the United States, Arizona, New Mexico. He tortures Pueblos, Navajos. He crucifies them. He thinks that they're holding back, that they're not telling him where the mineral wealth is. He burns down villages, sexually assaults his soldiers, sexually assault Indian women. It's a very, very different story from the story of de Vaca, which is one really of kind of cultural interaction, I guess you'd say. So for Texas history, the significant thing is Coronado passes into what's now the panhandle of Texas. He gets all the way up into Kansas. He looks for, there's this city, and if you can see it on the map, it's spelled Quivira, Quiveria, and he'd been told that this was a place of great wealth. And basically what the Indians were doing was they were just trying to get him out of their hair. So they kept saying, no, we don't have gold here, we don't have minerals here, but further north and further east, yes, so keep going, keep going. So Coronado gets there, there's nothing there, but from the point of view of Texas history, what's significant is that he travels through the panhandle of Texas. He describes the huge buffalo herds that started to exist, that existed at that time in North Texas. But ultimately, his mission's a failure. He does some mapping of this territory, but he's very bitter. He doesn't find the wealth that he's expecting to find, and he comes back into central Mexico a very, very bitter man. Now, here's the take-home point for Texas history. After the failed Coronado expedition of the 1540s, the Spanish basically ignore their northeast, which is now Texas, for almost 150 years. So Texas just drops off the radar screen of the Spanish in Mexico City and in Madrid. There's no mineral wealth here, although they keep hoping. The Indians up here are not seen as good candidates for Christianity. And so what you have in Texas is what doesn't happen. If there had been mineral wealth in Texas, there's a good chance that Texas would be still part of Mexico today because it would have been populated. But what happens is very, very few people in Mexico ever wanted to come up into Spanish Texas. It's too far from Mexico City. The Indians are too hostile. There's just not a lot of ways to make money here. Ultimately, you start having cattle ranching and horse ranching and sheep ranching in Texas, goat ranching. But Texas remains tremendously underpopulated. There's a saying, to populate is to govern. As late as 1820, just 16 years before the Alamo, there were probably only 4,000 people. 4,000. Much smaller than the population, even it's about the size of the incoming class at UTSA. 4,000 folks of European descent in Texas as late as 1820. So what you see in Texas, the Spanish ultimately will come up into Texas. They will create San Antonio, other towns, Goliad. They will settle Texas to an extent. But for most of the Spanish period, Texas is just seen as a headache. From the period of the 1540s until the 1680s, the Spanish, for the most part, completely ignore their northeastern region, which is Texas, which is kind of crazy to think about. But in the next podcast, there's going to be a jump of almost 150 years before the Spanish start paying attention to Texas again. And the only reason the Spanish ever pay attention to Texas is when they fear like they're going to lose it. And what happens is in the 1690s, the French have moved next door into Louisiana, and the Spanish are super paranoid the French are going to come in and steal Texas. But that'll be described in another podcast.